Some truths don't need a DNA test. They breathe, they cry, and they look you straight in the eye. Ethan Whitmore didn't plan to stop when he walked past that hospital room. His mind still locked on a multi-million-dollar deal waiting downtown, his polished shoes echoing against the sterile floor under cold fluorescent lights. But then he heard it, a newborn's cry, sharp and fragile, cutting through the noise of machines and distant voices, and something in it made him pause, just for a second, just long enough to turn his head toward the half-open door. Inside, Amara Collins lay still, against the white sheets, her skin glowing softly under the pale light, exhaustion written in every breath she took. Yet her arms held something steady, something undeniable, a tiny life wrapped in a hospital blanket. And when the nurse stepped aside, Ethan saw the baby's face clearly for the first time, saw the way those small eyes blinked open, gray, unmistakably gray, and the world he controlled so effortlessly seemed to tilt. Because he had seen those eyes before every morning in the mirror. Because no matter how many years or miles or decisions stood between this moment and the past he had buried, there was no explaining this away, no negotiating it, no rewriting it into something convenient. 12 hours earlier, Amara had walked into that hospital alone, no ring on her finger, no hand to hold, carrying not just the weight of the child but the silence she had chosen after every call went unanswered, after every door connected to Ethan Whitmore had quietly closed on her, and even as the pain rose and fell like waves, she refused to scream his name, refused to beg for someone who had already decided she didn't exist, because dignity, she had learned, was sometimes the only thing left to protect. Now that same silence filled the room again, heavier than any words, as Ethan stepped closer without realizing it, his breath slower, his heartbeat louder in his ears than the machines around them, his gaze locked on the child who shifted slightly, tiny fingers curling as if reaching for something familiar. And when his eyes finally lifted to meet Amara's, she didn't accuse him, didn't explain, didn't even welcome him there. She just watched, calm and unreadable, as if she had already accepted whatever truth this moment would force him to face. And in that stillness, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not power, not control, but the quiet, terrifying realization that this was a moment he couldn't walk away from, no matter how much he wanted to pretend it wasn't real. The room did not move, but everything inside Ethan Whitmore did as he stood there with his hand hovering in the air, unsure whether he was allowed to step closer or if he had already crossed a line he could never uncross. The sound of the baby's breathing soft but steady filling the space between him and the woman he once knew. And for a brief second, he searched for something familiar in Amara Collins beyond the silence. Something that would make this easier to understand, but all he found was a calm strength that did not ask for anything and did not need his approval to exist. He swallowed slowly, his voice lower than he expected when he finally spoke, asking how old the baby was, even though the answer was written in every detail around him. And Amara did not rush to answer. She simply adjusted the blanket with careful hands before saying 12 hours, her tone even, almost detached, as if she were stating a fact that no longer belonged to him. The number settled heavily in his chest. Because 12 hours ago he had been in a glass tower signing documents worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, celebrating control, precision, certainty, while here, in a quiet hospital room, something had been born that none of his decisions could undo. And he realized with a growing weight that time had not stopped for her when he walked away. It had only forced her to become stronger without him. His eyes returned to the child again, drawn by something deeper than curiosity now, something instinctive, undeniable. And when the baby shifted slightly, a tiny hand slipping free from the blanket, Ethan felt his breath catch as those small fingers curled instinctively, the same subtle movement he had seen in his own reflection countless mornings without ever thinking twice about it. And suddenly every excuse he had ever built began to feel fragile, like glass under pressure. He took a step closer this time, slower, more careful, as if the air itself demanded respect, and the nurse quietly stepped back, sensing something unspoken unfolding, leaving just the three of them in a silence that felt almost sacred. And for the first time in years, Ethan did not think about outcomes or strategies or control. He only listened to the rhythm of that room, the quiet proof of a life that existed whether he was ready for it or not. His voice softened again, asking why she had not told him, and this time Amara looked directly at him, her eyes steady, not angry, not pleading, just certain, and she answered with a quiet honesty that carried more weight than any accusation, saying that she did try, more than once, but every path to him had been closed before her words could reach him, and she would not beg to be heard by someone who had already decided not to listen. The truth in her voice did not rise. It did not need to. It settled into him like something permanent, something that could not be negotiated or dismissed. And Ethan felt a rare and unfamiliar pressure behind his composure, not from the situation itself, but from the realization that this was not a misunderstanding he could fix with influence or money. This was a choice he had made, one that had consequences now breathing in front of him. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft cry, and without thinking, Amara gently lifted the child and held him closer for a moment before extending him forward, not as an offering, not as a request, but as a simple, undeniable truth placed between them, and Ethan hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before slowly reaching out, his hands unsteady in a way he could not hide. And when the weight of the child finally rested in his arms, everything else seemed to fall away, the contracts, the titles, the distance he had built, because in that moment there was nothing abstract about this anymore, nothing he could avoid, only the quiet, overwhelming certainty that the life he had walked away from had found him again, and this time, it was not asking for permission to exist. The weight of the child in Ethan Whitmore's arms did not feel heavy, yet it anchored him in a way nothing ever had, his fingers instinctively adjusting to support the small, fragile body as if some part of him already understood what to do, and the baby's crying softened into quiet breaths, as though recognizing something familiar in the rhythm of the man holding him. And that subtle shift sent a deeper realization through Ethan that this connection was not imagined. It was not coincidence. It was something written long before this moment. He looked down, studying every detail with a focus he had never given anything outside of business. The curve of the child's cheek, the faint crease between his brows, the steady rise and fall of his chest, and with each second, the resemblance became harder to deny, not just in appearance but in presence. In the quiet way the child seemed to observe the world even at only 12 hours old, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar begin to break through the control he had built his entire life around. Across from him, Amara Collins watched without interruption, her posture relaxed despite everything her body had just endured, her gaze not fixed on Ethan but on the child, as if her world began and ended there, and that quiet separation made something inside him tighten, because he realized that she had already built a life that did not require him, a strength that did not depend on his acknowledgement, and for the first time, he was the one standing outside, trying to understand a reality he had chosen to ignore. He cleared his throat softly, as if searching for the right words, but none of the language he used in boardrooms seemed to fit here. None of it could measure or contain what he was holding, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than ever before, asking what the child's name was, and Amara answered after a brief pause, her tone steady, saying his name is Elias, a name chosen without consultation, without expectation, a name that carried meaning Ethan had not been part of, and yet hearing it stirred something deep within him, something that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. Elias shifted slightly, his small hand brushing against Ethan's wrist, and the contact, light as it was, sent a quiet shock through him, because it felt intentional, as if the child was grounding him in that moment, pulling him away from every distraction, every excuse, every carefully constructed distance. And Ethan realized that for all his power, for all his control, he had never experienced anything that demanded his presence so completely without asking for permission. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding that did not need to be spoken. And Ethan slowly looked up at Amara again, his expression no longer guarded but searching, as if he was seeing her fully for the first time, not as a memory he could dismiss, but as the person who had carried this truth alone while he lived untouched by it. And the weight of that realization settled heavily on him, not as guilt shouted out loud, but as something quieter and more permanent, something that would not fade once he walked out of the room. He took a small step closer to the bed, still holding Elias carefully, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. And in that fragile stillness, the distance between them shifted, not because of words or apologies, but because the truth no longer needed either of them to explain it. It simply existed, undeniable and complete, and Ethan understood then that this was only the beginning of something he could not control, something that would require more than acknowledgement, more than presence, something that would demand change, whether he was ready for it or not. The name lingered in Ethan Whitmore's mind longer than he expected, Elias, repeating quietly in the silence as if it carried a weight he had not yet earned the right to understand. And as he held the child closer, he became aware of something deeper than recognition, something that pressed against his chest with a steady, undeniable force, not urgency, not panic, but responsibility. A word he had always defined on his own terms until this moment rewrote it completely. Elias stirred again, his small face shifting slightly as his eyes opened just enough to catch the light. And Ethan found himself holding his breath, watching as those gray eyes moved without focus yet still seemed to search, and it unsettled him in a way no negotiation ever had. Because there was no strategy here, no outcome he could predict, only a presence that required him to be still, to be present in a way he had avoided for years. Across from him, Amara Collins adjusted her position slightly against the pillows, her movements careful but composed, and though her body showed the exhaustion of everything she had just endured, her expression remained steady, untouched by the tension that quietly filled the room, and that calmness unsettled Ethan even more, because it told him she was not waiting for his reaction, not hoping for his approval. She had already accepted whatever came next, with or without him. He finally spoke again, his voice lower, almost unfamiliar to himself, asking if she had everything she needed. The question simple on the surface, yet carrying everything he did not know how to say, and Amara met his gaze briefly before answering that she had what mattered, her eyes shifting toward Elias for just a second, and that single glance carried more meaning than any explanation, drawing a clear line between what she valued and what she no longer expected. Ethan nodded slightly, though the gesture felt incomplete, as if agreement was not enough to bridge the distance that had grown between them, and for the first time, he recognized that distance not as something physical, but as something built. From choices, from moments where he had turned away instead of looking closer, moments that could not simply be undone because he had finally chosen to see. He looked down again at Elias, noticing the subtle details he had missed before, the gentle way the child's breathing had settled, the quiet trust in the way he rested without resistance. And that trust struck Ethan with unexpected force, because it existed without knowledge, without history, without judgment, and he realized that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to the world. It would be about becoming someone worthy of that quiet trust. The hallway outside carried faint sounds of movement, distant voices, the world continuing as if nothing inside this room had shifted. But for Ethan, everything had. The priorities that once defined him now felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the life in his arms. And he understood that stepping out of this room would not return things to what they were before. Because he could not unknow what he now held. He could not unsee what had been placed directly in front of him. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then carefully stepped closer to the bed, his movements deliberate, as if each step acknowledged something unspoken. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before, not the certainty of control, but the beginning of something else, something uncertain yet real. And though he did not yet have the words to define it, the shift was there, in the way he stood, in the way he held Elias, in the way he no longer looked for a way out of the moment, but remained fully inside it, knowing that whatever came next would require more than presence. It would require change he could not delegate, and for the first time, Ethan Whitmore did not resist that truth. The air in the room shifted in a way that could not be measured, subtle yet undeniable, as Ethan Whitmore stood there holding Elias, no longer questioning whether he belonged in this moment, but realizing how unprepared he was for what it required. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for control, he reached for understanding, his gaze moving slowly from the child in his arms back to Amara Collins, who remained composed, her silence never empty, always intentional, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said long before he arrived. He took a quiet breath and asked what happens now. The question simple, but heavier than any contract he had ever signed, because it carried no clear terms, no defined outcome, only uncertainty. And Amara did not answer immediately, her eyes resting on Elias for a moment before she finally spoke, her voice steady, explaining that what happens next does not depend on her alone. And that was the first time Ethan felt the full weight of inclusion, not as authority, but as accountability, because this was no longer a situation he could observe from a distance. It was something he was already part of, whether he had chosen it or not. Elias shifted slightly in his arms, a soft sound escaping him, and instinctively, Ethan adjusted his hold, more confident this time, more aware, as if his body was learning faster than his mind could process. And that quiet adaptation revealed something deeper, something he had not expected. To find in himself a capacity to care without calculation, without hesitation, and it unsettled him because it felt real, not constructed, not controlled. He glanced around the room briefly, noticing details he had ignored before: the neatly folded blanket at the corner of the bed, the small identification band around Elias's wrist, the faint hum of machines that now felt less intrusive and more like a steady reminder that life continued whether acknowledged or not. And he realized that while he had spent years building a world defined by precision and distance, Amara had built something entirely different, something rooted in presence, in endurance, in quiet strength that did not need recognition to be valid. His attention returned to her again, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, only a growing awareness that he had underestimated not just the situation, but her, the way she had carried this truth alone without forcing it into his world, without demanding space in a life that had excluded her. And that realization did not come with guilt shouted out loud. It came with something quieter and more lasting: respect, the kind that could not be faked or negotiated. He stepped closer again, carefully, as if acknowledging that proximity itself meant something now. And when he spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that had begun to form from something deeper than confidence, saying that he was not walking away this time, not because he felt obligated, but because he understood that leaving again would not erase what already existed. It would only define him in a way he could no longer accept. And though the words were simple, they carried a shift that neither of them could ignore. Amara listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, not softened by his statement, not hardened either, simply present. And after a brief pause, she responded with quiet clarity, telling him that words were easy to say in a moment like this, but what mattered was what remained when the moment passed. And her voice did not challenge him, it grounded him, reminding him that this was not about proving something now. It was about consistency, about choices made when no one was watching. Ethan nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, because for the first time, he saw the path ahead not as something he could control, but something he would have to walk step by step, without shortcuts, without guarantees. And as he looked down at Elias once more, feeling the steady warmth of the child in his arms, he realized that this was not a disruption to his life. It was the beginning of a new one that would demand more than anything he had built before. And for once, he did not look for a way to manage it. He accepted that he would have to become someone different to meet it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like a space waiting to see if it would be filled with action or left behind like everything else that had once mattered. And Ethan Whitmore understood that this moment was no longer about what he said, but about what he would choose next when the world outside this room pulled him back into the life he had always known. He looked down at Elias again, noticing how naturally the child rested against him now, the small, steady breaths creating a rhythm that grounded him in a way nothing ever had. And it became clear that this was not something temporary, not something he could visit and then walk away from without consequence. This was something that would remain whether he stayed or not. And that realization carried more weight than any decision he had ever made. He gently adjusted his hold before stepping closer to the bed, lowering himself slightly so that Amara Collins could see the child clearly without strain. And for a moment, the three of them existed in a quiet alignment, not defined by past distance or future uncertainty, but by the undeniable present that connected them. And it was in that stillness that Ethan felt the first real shift within himself. Not forced, not calculated, but forming naturally as he allowed himself to remain instead of retreat. He spoke again, more carefully this time, asking what Elias would need in the coming days, not as a businessman offering solutions, but as someone trying to understand a role he had never prepared for. And Amara listened, her expression steady as always, before answering with quiet clarity that what the child needed was consistency, presence, and honesty, things that could not be bought or arranged from a distance. And her words settled deeply, not as criticism, but as truth that left no space for interpretation. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing each word, recognizing that everything she named stood in direct contrast to the way he had lived, where time was segmented, presence was scheduled, and honesty was often shaped to fit outcomes. And for the first time, he saw those patterns not as strengths, but as limitations, barriers, that would not hold in this space. And he realized that if he was going to remain, truly remain, he would have to dismantle parts of himself he had once relied on. Elias made a soft sound, shifting slightly in his arms, and Ethan instinctively steadied him, his movements becoming more natural, less hesitant, as if something within him was learning in real time, adapting without instruction. And that quiet growth gave him a sense of clarity he had not expected, a realization that change did not always begin with certainty. Sometimes it began with presence, with choosing not to step away. His gaze lifted again to meet Amara's, and this time there was no distance left in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had brought them here and everything that still needed to be faced. And without raising his voice or making promises he could not yet define, he told her that he would be here tomorrow and the day after that, not as a statement meant to impress, but as a commitment he understood would only matter if it was kept. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer than before, as if measuring not the words themselves but the intention behind them. And though her expression did not soften, there was no dismissal in it either, only a calm acceptance that the truth would reveal itself over time, not in declarations, but in actions repeated when no one was watching. The faint sounds of the hospital continued beyond the walls, nurses moving, doors opening and closing, the world maintaining its steady pace. But inside that room, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because for the first time, Ethan Whitmore was not thinking about how to leave. He was thinking about how to stay. And as he looked down at Elias once more, feeling the quiet warmth of the child against him, he understood that staying would not be a single decision. It would be a series of choices made again and again, each one shaping the man he would have to become. The room remained quiet except for the soft rhythm of Elias's breathing, a steady pulse that anchored Ethan Whitmore in a way he had never experienced before. And as he gently adjusted the child in his arms, he realized that everything he had thought he knew about responsibility and presence had shifted, because this was not something that could be measured by schedules or deadlines. It was living, it was constant, it demanded attention without coercion, and it reminded him in every subtle movement of the child that some truths did not bend to influence or authority. He looked across at Amara Collins, noticing the calm strength that had carried her through every moment he had once ignored. The quiet way she held herself, her eyes never leaving Elias even when she acknowledged him, and Ethan felt a deep, unspoken understanding form, that he could not impose himself into their world. He could only become part of it by observing, learning, and respecting the boundaries she had established with such clarity. He took another slow breath, feeling the weight of the child, the warmth against his chest, the rise and fall of tiny shoulders, and realized that the connection he felt was not about claiming. It was about witnessing, being present without expectation. And that presence alone demanded more of him than any business deal ever had, more than any controlled environment could teach, because it required patience, humility, and the willingness to accept that some aspects of life could not be commanded, only nurtured. Elias shifted slightly, a soft whimper escaping, and instinctively Ethan adjusted his hold again, careful not to startle him. And in that small motion, he sensed the beginning of a bond that would develop slowly, shaped by repeated acts of care and attention, not by words or promises. And it struck him that he had never understood the quiet power of such responsibility until this moment. He glanced back at Amara, and their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No explanations necessary, no apologies offered, only the recognition that what had begun could not be reversed, that the life they now shared in this room had already rewritten the rules of what mattered. The hospital lights cast a soft glow, reflecting off the walls and highlighting small details that had previously gone unnoticed. The identification band on Elias's wrist, the faint pattern of wrinkles on the blanket, the subtle hum of machinery that now felt less like a clinical reminder and more like a steady companion, marking time in a space that had become sacred through presence rather than design. Ethan's thoughts moved from the practical to the personal, considering how he could maintain this presence without overwhelming it, how he could honor the delicate balance Amara had created while learning to exist within it. And he realized that every choice he had made in the past, every calculated decision, had prepared him only in part, because this required adaptability, attentiveness, and a humility that could not be measured in outcomes, only in small gestures repeated consistently. He took another careful step closer to the bed, adjusting his posture so that both Amara and Elias could be comfortable, and he spoke softly, not as a command, not as a request, but as an expression of his willingness to participate in a shared responsibility, acknowledging the depth of what it meant to remain present in a life that had already established its own rules. Amara's gaze softened ever so slightly, though her posture remained steady, and Ethan understood that it was not approval she offered. It was recognition that he had chosen to begin a process, a journey, of integration into a life that had been shaped without him. And that recognition was more meaningful than any words could convey. Outside the room, the sounds of the hospital continued, distant and unobtrusive, but within the walls, time felt suspended, marked only by the gentle rhythm of Elias's breaths and the silent, mutual understanding forming between the three of them. And Ethan Whitmore realized that this moment, delicate and unassuming as it appeared, was the true measure of presence, the beginning of a transformation that would demand patience, consistency, and respect, and he felt ready to meet it for the first time. The quiet in the room felt heavier now, not oppressive, but charged with the unspoken understanding that had formed between Ethan Whitmore and Amara Collins, a recognition that the child in his arms, Elias, was a bond neither of them could deny or manipulate. And as he held him closer, feeling the delicate warmth of life that depended entirely on presence and care, Ethan realized that every moment of absence he had allowed in the past had been a choice, and every choice moving forward would require active participation, not excuses, not distance, but consistent engagement with a reality that refused to bend to power or influence. He looked up at Amara, noting the slight crease of her brow, a subtle sign that despite her composed exterior, she was measuring every action, every intention, and he understood that trust would not be given freely. It would have to be earned through repeated demonstration, and that realization both humbled and focused him, because nothing in his life of wealth and command had prepared him for the precision of moral responsibility, for the accountability that comes without leverage, without hierarchy, only with the sheer force of presence and commitment. Elias shifted gently, his tiny hand brushing against Ethan's chest, and that simple, innocent gesture reinforced a truth that Ethan could no longer ignore, that the child's dependence was absolute, immediate, and transformative, demanding more than superficial attention, more than performative involvement, and he felt an unfamiliar surge of determination to rise to the challenge, to inhabit the role he had avoided for so long, to exist fully in a life that had begun without him. Amara watched him carefully, her eyes steady, not judging, but assessing, and in that quiet observation, Ethan sensed the beginning of reconciliation, not through words, but through the deliberate act of staying present, of learning, of allowing himself to be guided as much as he guided, and he understood that this mutual recognition would shape the trajectory of their future interactions, because it was based on reality rather than aspiration, on action rather than assumption. He adjusted Elias gently in his arms, observing the subtle cues of the child's comfort and discomfort, learning the silent language that did not require explanation. And in that moment he realized that the ability to respond thoughtfully to another life was far more demanding and far more rewarding than anything he had ever achieved in the corporate world. a truth that was immediate and undeniable, pressing against him with quiet insistence. The soft hum of the hospital machinery, the distant footsteps, the muted voices outside, all receded as Ethan centered himself on the space directly in front of him, on the life he held and the lives connected to it. And he understood that presence was not passive, it was active, requiring awareness, empathy, and patience, qualities that had been dormant, neglected, or untested in him until now. He looked at Amara one final time in that moment, his gaze steady and unflinching, silently acknowledging her resilience, her foresight, and the deliberate structure she had imposed on a life that could have been chaos, and he felt a deep respect for the balance she maintained, recognizing that entering this new chapter required humility, attention, and consistency, and that the privilege of being part of it was conditional upon his willingness to embody those qualities continuously. Elias stirred slightly again, letting out a small, soft sound, and Ethan instinctively adjusted his hold, feeling the bond of responsibility as something tangible, almost weighty in its significance. And in that small movement, he found clarity and resolve, knowing that the days ahead would demand effort, presence, and integrity, and he was prepared to meet that challenge, step by careful step, with the awareness that true engagement with this new life was not about control, but about constancy, patience, and respect, and that understanding had already begun to reshape him from the inside out. Ethan Whitmore felt a quiet shift within himself as he stood holding Elias, the weight of responsibility settling into his chest in a way that was both grounding and unfamiliar. And he understood that the decisions he would make from this point forward would not be about convenience or power, but about consistent presence, about honoring the life in his arms and the woman who had carried that life with dignity and resolve. He looked at Amara Collins once more, taking in the composed strength that radiated from her, the way she had navigated the last 12 hours alone and emerged not broken, but steadfast. And he realized that the respect he now felt could not be expressed through words alone. It required action. It required a patience and attentiveness he had never needed in his world of deals and authority. Elias stirred, stretching tiny limbs, and Ethan adjusted his hold with careful precision, observing every subtle motion, every expression, learning the language of the small life entrusted to him. And it struck him that nurturing was a discipline in itself, one that demanded humility, focus, and unwavering dedication, qualities he had never prioritized until now. Amara watched quietly, her eyes never leaving the child. But when they flicked to Ethan, there was a measured acknowledgement, not approval, not invitation, but recognition that he was beginning to meet the challenge, that the act of staying present, of learning, of responding thoughtfully, was already a step toward trust, and he felt the weight of that unspoken permission, heavy with meaning, yet liberating in its clarity. The room seemed to shrink around them. The hum of machines, the distant movement of hospital staff, all fading into the background as the focus narrowed to the three of them. The soft breaths, the small sounds, the careful interactions that defined the moment. And Ethan realized that life was not measured by ambition or accumulation, but by these quiet, deliberate acts of care, repeated consistently over time. He shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around Elias, ensuring warmth and comfort, and in that small gesture he felt a connection, a tether not forged by obligation but by the recognition of what was necessary and true, a connection that would guide him in the days and weeks to come. Amara's gaze remained steady, unflinching, and Ethan understood that her calm was not indifference, but mastery over circumstance, a quiet strength that had been honed through experience and choice. And he felt both admiration and a solemn awareness that entering fully into this space required the same level of intention, the same respect for boundaries and rhythm, and the willingness to let go of control in exchange for meaningful engagement. He spoke softly, asking about the routines and needs, the small things that mattered for the child's well-being, not as an instruction but as an inquiry, and Amara answered with careful clarity, each word shaping a framework he would need to follow, not for his convenience, but for the proper care of the life in his arms. And he listened intently, absorbing the information as if it were a manual for a world he had never inhabited. one that demanded presence and patience rather than power and strategy. Elias stirred again, a tiny hand brushing against Ethan's chest, and that simple contact filled him with a resolve that had been absent from his life for years, a recognition that some forms of influence are earned through consistent action rather than asserted. And that realization brought a subtle shift in posture, a steadying of heart and mind, as he committed, silently, to remain engaged, to honor the trust implicit in this moment, to participate fully in a life that could not be controlled, only nurtured. The hospital lights cast a soft glow over the scene, illuminating small, intimate details, the pattern on the blanket, the curve of Elias's cheek, the careful arrangement of the room, and Ethan felt a profound awareness that these details, small yet significant, were part of the fabric of this new life, a life in which his presence mattered not because of authority, but because of commitment, attentiveness, and enduring care. And in that understanding, he sensed the first true measure of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, a beginning that would demand patience, integrity, and unwavering focus. And he embraced it fully, ready to meet the challenge with consistent presence, humility, and respect.